When we think about serving people with disabilities and having people with disabilities in our family, it's often very serious. We have to talk about a lot of different issues. However, we don't want to cloud the fact that a lot of having a person and a child with special needs in our family, a lot of it's a lot of fun. And we want to talk about joy today.
Hi, I'm Brian, and this is Paul, and we're practical theologians and also parents of special needs kids.
So what we'll do is we'll tell a couple stories today, and then we'll make a couple comments. This should be fun. And I'm going to start out. My children and I used to love to go to the library. My parents took me to the library, so I took my kids to the library. When they were 4 and 5, I would take them to our local public library, and for me it had a fantastic book section of New York Times bestsellers. They were always up to date and current. So we got into a pattern of taking the kids to the library. They had a great children's section. I would go in there, get them settled, they'd be looking for books, and then I would go over and look at all the new books. And they would do fine, and they'd come out with a stack of books, and I'd come out with a stack of books, and we'd all be happy. So what I did one day was got them over to the children's book section. They started looking for books, went over to the new bookshelf. I said, I'll be back in 20 minutes. Well, time has a way of flying when you're looking at books, right?
Amen.
So I looked up at the clock, and it had been about 35 minutes maybe, and I thought, oh boy, I better go and check in on the kids. Well, I ran over to the children's section, and what I saw, Jonathan and Emily, they were there, they were happy. My son, though, was going like this. And I mean, there was something very large in his mouth, and my daughter too. And I walked over, and I said, Jonathan, Emily, what's that in your mouth? And my daughter said, nothing. But my son he's honest all the time. He said, it's gum. And they're chewing, and I'm thinking, this is baseball-sized gum. Like, what's going on here? So I said, where did you get the gum? And Emily said, who found it? Well, Jonathan looks at Emily and looks at me and starts laughing, and he said, under the table. I just went, what? He said, we found the gum under the table. I said, all of that? And he said, well, no, we found one, and so I got one, and then we found one for Emily, and she got one, and we thought, this is so good, so we looked under all the chairs and the tables, and we found all the gum that we could find, and I'm speechless. And I'm thinking hepatitis C, what other diseases, but I'm also trying to keep a straight face. It's like, this is hilarious. They're chewing probably 200 people's gum. And they're looking at me like they're having so much fun and they're so innocent. Now I've got to be the dad and explain the dangers of this. So I'm trying to keep a straight face, and I'm saying, look, kids, and Jonathan and Emily, you got to spit that out now. And so Emily said, okay, and spit hers out, and Jonathan took it and put it in his mouth. Now he can barely close his mouth. He's chewing so much gum. I'm saying, Jonathan, you have to spit that out. So anyways, we get to the waste basket, and with much disappointment, Jonathan spits out his gum, and then I said, we got to go to the washroom and rinse our mouths out, and then when we get home, we've got to use mouthwash and toothpaste. And I said, you could have got hepatitis C, you could have got other diseases, and all they looked at me like, but it tasted so good. And I was like, why wouldn't anybody do this? Why would people leave it there? Of course, we'll come in and do this every week. And it was unbelievable.
We're probably the same, and that half of the pleasure is the sheer social transgression involved in that behavior. And I have a story that's similarly funny. Our son Adam likes to sort of interact with people when he's walking down the street. So he very often is giving people the elbow or sort of tapping people. So constantly when we're walking down the street, people are kind of looking back and giving him the what's going
Oh,
on
no.
here? And
Oh no.
we were at the beach in North Carolina, and there was a long boardwalk out to the surf, and it went through a kind of marshy area that had tall reeds in it, and the boardwalk was about chest height from the ground below. Well, there was a chain gang out
From a prison?
from a prison, yeah. So
Wow.
there's about, I don't know, 15, 20 guys in orange suits, cutting the reeds next to the walkway. So we're walking along, and the boardwalk is about at their chest, and there's a whole string of them, and the boardwalk is about, I don't know, 3 feet wide, and there's one cop standing there, overseeing.
So he's in charge.
He's in charge, and he's making sure that nobody hits the run, and so our whole family's trooping down in our bathing suits to the beach, and Adam is in the lead, and he's marching with his elbows out, and the cop steps back with his heels to the edge of the boardwalk, and Adam, just as he does, sort of gives him a backhand, which hits him right in the zipper. And
The private.
Yeah,
Oh no.
and of course the
no.
cop doubles over, and all of the prisoners fall down laughing, and Adam didn't even stop. He just went on by, and we were glad
Oh,
that the
my
cop was forgiving, but we provided the day's entertainment to the prisoners, that's for sure.
Oh man, so you gave them a laugh. Well, so those are two really funny stories, and when I got home, my wife didn't see the humor in this, and it was like, you should have kept a closer eye on them. So it was one of those, I guess you had to be there moments, and it's the same with your son doing that. It sounds hilarious. Being there would be even funnier. So one thing we want to say to parents and members at churches, people who are friends, enjoy the funny moments, because there's a lot of joy that we have when we have someone who doesn't follow all the social conventions.
And it's a type of contextual humor, and there's a
Right.
lot of it, and it happens all the time. And you don't really get to enjoy it unless you're there getting to know them, spending time with them, seeing how they interact with the world.
So take those moments, and I would say look for the humor in our situations, because there's so much of it. Another little more, still very joyful. Another story. I was driving my son, and we had to get him to a soccer practice, and I had a really important lunch meeting, and I can't remember what it was. Well, I've taught my children, we've had a bunch of foster kids, and we've adopted children. And I taught my children that when a child doesn't have a family, we should provide them with a family. When somebody's hungry, we need to give them food. And so we need to take care of homeless people, other people. Well, they took it to heart, maybe even more than I wanted them to. So it got to be where if somebody was on the freeway entrance with a sign, we had to stop even if all the horns were blaring. Well, this one particular day, we were walking out of Starbucks. I'd got a coffee before I take Jonathan to soccer, and I go to my meeting. Well, and there's a man there who's homeless, and Jonathan walks up to him and says, "Are you hungry?" And the gentleman says, "Yes, I'm hungry." And Jonathan walks over to me and says, "Dad, we've got to go and have lunch with this gentleman." And I just looked at Jonathan, and I was thinking, soccer practice so I can get to my appointment on time. And I said, "What if we just gave him some money to get food?" And he said, "No, we have to show that we care about him. We have to have lunch with him. You told us we need to spend time with people." And I'm now looking at my son, and it's like, okay, you remember the Good Samaritan story? I'm the Pharisee. I'm the lawyer. I'm the guy who's saying, I got stuff to do, for crying out loud. So, but I look at my son, and he says, we're going to have lunch with him, and now he's being a little, he's dug in his heels. But when I'm looking at my son, I'm also thinking, oh, man, God's standing right behind him, probably. And I'm not just arguing with my son, I'm arguing with my son and God. Mm-hmm. So I gave up. And I said, okay, let's go in, we'll buy him lunch, and we'll have lunch with him. So we had a nice lunch, and once I made the decision to do it, it was great. And I kind of facilitated Jonathan having a conversation. I believe the man's name was Kurt, and Jonathan and Kurt had a good conversation. We had lunch, and we still got out pretty quick, Well, when I got Jonathan to soccer practice, he was late. When I got to my appointment, I was late. But when I explained what happened, the person I was meeting thought it was wonderful. And so there were no bad results. I just went from our efficiency time clock time to God's loving, caring time. And so that was an experience that I thought, wait a minute, that was joyful, and I heard from God.
And I bet when you got to your meeting and explained what had happened, they also understood.
I think that they heard from God too, but I heard from God that day, and I hear from God a lot through my son and through my children.
Yeah, that reminds me of another story with Adam. At church one Sunday, one thing that Adam also does is he greets people sometimes by touching them on the mouth. We don't really know why he does that, but I would translate it as him saying hello, or I'm here with you.
So Adam's nonverbal.
Yes, he doesn't really speak. I mean, he speaks a little bit, but largely he's gestural in his communication. So one Sunday, our pastor, he only told me this story afterwards, but I was with Adam and with him when we took communion after the sermon, and the sermon had been on Jesus' teaching about divorce. And in this particular church, there was a very prominent couple who'd been separated and living in different houses, but still married for a long time. And our pastor Isaac was in the position of having to preach on this passage because of the lectionary, and he, of course, found it acutely uncomfortable. So then after the sermon, we went up for communion, and we were there at the rail having communion, and we happened to be next to that couple. And as you can imagine, our pastor, as he was serving them communion, was feeling quite an inner tension about the role he felt himself being put into by the scriptures and the sermon that day. And so he served the couple in question, and then he came to Adam, who, for the first time ever, reached up and just touched him on the lips. And Isaac, our pastor, said he experienced that like Isaiah, who said, "I'm a man of unclean lips," and the angel of the Lord came and put a coal on his lips and cleansed his lips prophetically.
So a peaceful prophetic moment that Adam did a prophetic act.
Exactly, and it was the first time that he'd done that, and you'd think, oh, well, maybe it's kind of an accident, but then it happened again a year later. A friend of ours, a young woman, Hannah, was preaching in the university chapel, and she'd had a very rough couple of days, including a death, and she felt very intimidated about preaching at all, and but she felt that she really needed to do it, and she got up and she preached the sermon, was very unhappy with it, and felt like it had been just an excruciating experience. And once again, for the first time, Adam sort of came up and gave her a hug spontaneously, and they don't know one another very well, so there seems to be something that he senses that is God's own presence to people in moments of need, and that has manifested itself in really profound and moving ways in our life in the church.
That's deep. It's fascinating. So God speaks through our kids and through adults, people with disabilities. God will speak through them in unusual ways that we don't expect, ways that are different, and they capture our attention. So a couple of suggestions for parents. First of all, like I said, actively seek. We have whatever we pay attention to, that's what we see. So we can pay attention to problems all day long, and we have so many challenges that it's easy to get in the rut of that.
Absolutely, it's very easy to just get stuck in problem solving.
Right, so instead we should try and focus our attention on everything that we can that's funny, that's humorous. It will help us. We'll feel lighter. For church members, we're serving people with disabilities. We need to serve people in our community with disabilities. It could be the elderly with dementia. It could be young children, teenagers, adults. let's look for the humor in the situation. Let's not be afraid to laugh and enjoy it, because the people we're serving will enjoy it too. They're very intelligent, and they think well and or experience well. We don't know always, and we can't read a person's inner life, any person's inner life. But I know that when we experience joy, it's contagious. So that's one thing. The other thing with both your son and these two preachers, and with my son and the homeless person, is that God speaks through God can speak through anyone. I'm finding that God speaks more often through my son to me than maybe any other person. God speaks in very profound ways. So as parents, I think we need to be aware that God will speak to us very profoundly through, as parents or as caregivers, through the person we're caring for. Because we're paying close attention to them, I believe God uses them as a person to speak closely to us. So parents, we ought to think that way. And again, church members. And we need to think that way, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that part of the way that people with disabilities change us and they cause us to see things differently is they require us to be with them in more intensive ways, and they do more things that we can't imagine or understand, and that often once we've spent time with them, we begin to see the world in the way that they see it. And I think that's one of the catalysts for these really eye-opening moments of revelation.
Right. I think that's really good, and I want us to move forward. One statement I'll make is that my son, when we read the Bible, he takes it literally. I take it literally too. When Jesus says, "Go and help people, go and do this, go and do that, pray for people for healing." Well, my son has more faith than I do often, and he'll say, "Pray for this person for healing. God's going to heal them because that's what the Bible says." So I believe that we get stuck in certain ways of thinking, but the people we care for are not stuck in society's standard ways of thinking, and so it takes us outside the box where God can speak to us more clearly. I'm going to tell a quick story and then we'll end. Is that okay? Yeah. Dave Roberts is a pastor of Montrose Community Church. I made a small mini documentary about Michael, who goes to Montrose Community Church. You can find it on YouTube at Messengers of Hope Film, so you get the right Messengers of Hope. Dave has a small church in Montrose, and they had about 500 members, and they had a couple members whose children had disabilities. Well, they were involved in the Special Olympics, and so one year the Tri-Valley Games for the 3 cities surrounding Montrose, one year they didn't have enough volunteers and they didn't have enough money, and so they had to cancel the games. Well, the pastor saw how deeply discouraged these 2 kids were and their families, and he thought, that's what we should be doing. Ministry is finding a need in the community and filling it. So he went and talked to the Tri-Valley sponsors, and he talked to his board, and he talked to these families, and he determined that this would never fall through the cracks again, in his words. So the following year, their church of about 500 people provided about 400 volunteers for this, and they trained and they set it up, and there was a financial deficit, and they made a commitment every year to meet the financial deficit of the Tri-Valley Games. Well, what happened was they had a wonderful experience. They had a wonderful time with the community, the disability community, and the Special Olympics community. The church members were energized. Dave says now this is more exciting than Christmas or Easter for their church members. They look forward to the Tri-Valley Games more than either of those. His church has been growing, and it's been growing with members in the community who are getting saved, who are coming to know Christ, who are wanting to be part of their church community, and it's family members of people with disabilities, but it's also just the community is hearing about what they're doing, and they're in the center of the community. And so when I was talking to Dave about this wonderful heroic service they were doing, he looked at me with kind of a grin, and I know about this because my son is involved in sports where I'm experiencing this. he had a grin and he says, well, you know, Paul, all I have to do is get our members out there for a day. And when we spend a day with these people and their families, with the people in the disability communities and their families, he says to me, it's really hard to know who's serving who. And he said, I am persuaded that we're all getting more out of it than they are. And I thought, that's profound, and he's right, and yet we won't know it until we experience it. So I would suggest churches we need to experience these communities, and we will find so much joy in being a part of these communities. We don't need to bring them in to be our community first. We can go out and be part of their community. But in every case, look for joy.
I think that's a good.
I'm happy with
those
it.
are great last words.